Good morning. We're going to conclude our series that we've had in the month of September today. The title of the series has been No Fighting in Church, and the idea of it has been to be preventative medicine, the kind of thing, the lessons we want to learn and put into our character, not because we got a problem today, but because we know there's always one down the road a ways. There's always an opportunity in a church setting because there's people here. Nobody fights in empty auditoriums. That's the only way to be sure you don't have any arguments at church, is just get everybody out of it. But if you have people in church, sometimes they argue. That happens. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's large. It happens. And so we've been having this discussion all through the month of September about how Jesus has taught us how to behave ourselves better, how to be more forgiving, how to be more humble, to be more patient with each other. And we're going to continue that today. And we're going to begin by asking the question, where does negativity come from? There's few things. It doesn't even have to be a church. It can be any organization. It can be the workplace. It can be a family, any group of people whatsoever. You inject enough negativity in that, and it doesn't take much, and it acts as a poison. It taints and corrupts everything it touches. So where does it come from? Nobody likes it. I have yet to meet a person that says, boy, I really enjoy a healthy dose of negativity in the morning. Nobody does, but it just follows us around. Where does it come from? In churches in particular, but again, this applies to any organization, church fights often come from the tension between tribes. By the way, side note for you kids that have the worksheet today, I tried to underline the word you're looking for on most of the slides. I might have missed one, but I was trying to make it easier for you, so we'll see how that works. But for the adults that are like, why did he underline that word? May not have any particular reason, but it was the word in the blank, so that's why it's underlined. Anyway, church fights often come from the tension between tribes. And by tribes, I mean just any particular kind of group. When you have inside of a group little subsets of groups, those groups eventually get on each other's nerves. If you're in the New Testament, you can see it between Jew and Gentile. In fact, most of the letters of Paul at some point address the tension between Jew and Gentile. Because you have two groups of people inside the same church, one from a Jewish background, one from a Gentile background, trying to sit together and worship together and share Christ together. And invariably, didn't matter if it was in Philippi or Ephesus, everywhere, they got on each other's nerves. It's in Corinth, it's in Romans. Literally every epistle of Paul at some point mentions, oh, by the way, I know you Jews and Gentiles don't get along. Here's a word or two about that. It was pandemic-like in all the churches. You can see it between rich and poor in a congregation. James chapter 2 addresses this. He says, I've noticed that you treat the richer person differently than you do the poorer person. You may not be doing it intentionally, but you do it. And those people start to treat each other differently, and you get a rift. I saw on Facebook the other day somebody posted, if Paul were to write a letter to the Church of America today, what would it say? And my answer is, I don't know, but it would have at least two words in it, Democrat and Republican. And the next two words would probably be, stop it, right? That if we come forward 2,000 years from the era of Jews and Gentile, we have our own little systems of belief and little subsets in a congregation and in national life, and we get on each other's nerves and we irritate each other. And this, again, is the way of things. This is how people interact. And a lot of our negativity and our tension come from these little warring factions. You can call them cliques, you can call them tribes, you can call them factions that exist within churches. Another one that comes up a lot in my experience, in any church I've ever been part of has had this in it. There are those who give and those who need. There are people that are there that have been long-time participants of the church, that are stable in their life, that are servants, that are givers, that are generous. There are people that make the church function, make it possible. And then there are other people that come in that are in desperate need. It could be financially, it could be spiritually. Their life is not nice and tidy. Their life is a mess. Their family is just holding together with duct tape. The whole thing is about to come unraveled. And sometimes you can get some resentment from the people that feel like they've got it together and the people who definitely know they don't. people who are giving in their service and their money and their time and their wisdom, their experience, and the people who just desperately need that. Okay? And those groups of people will kind of irritate each other over time. Because over time, the givers look at the needers and say, why can't you get your act together? And the people that need look at the people that give and say, you've got it all figured out. Why don't you just help me out? And they start to resent each other over time. And again, this happens in any church I've been in. And then what we do, what's the next thing we do? We start to have a little tension, start to have a little friction between these groups. And as we said in the very first or so lesson, I guess the second lesson in this series, instead of talking to the person, we start talking about the person. So I go to the other people in my tribe, my little faction, and I say, can you believe those guys over there? And of course, because you're in my group, you say, I know. You don't correct me and say, Ben, you should probably go work that out. You say, I know. Those guys are the worst. And you start to talk about them and not to them. Shorthand language for that is complaining. If I am making an inventory of the flaws in my life, one of the things on it, just speaking personally, is going to be complaining. It's one of the things I do far more than I like. I make mountains out of molehills in my own life, and I don't like it about myself. So today, this sermon applies to you, great, but I'm mostly just preaching to Ben, and if it happens to hit anybody else, great. But for me, I ask myself, how can I become a person who complains less? How can I do that? I start off every morning with that goal. Usually make it to about my second cup of coffee, and I'm already in it. Become defensive or negative, and in my head start thinking about other people negatively. How can I change that? Today's text is going to come from Matthew, the 20th chapter. We've been in Matthew 18 for this whole series, but I want to skip ahead one chapter and go to the 20th chapter, where I think he offers us some wisdom that would be enormously beneficial in a parable, the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. And in this particular parable, we get really distracted by various doctrines that get taught out of it. It actually has a much simpler lesson, and it's how to change the way we think about others. And I think the mainstay of the whole parable is this simple thought. Negativity and complaint comes from forgetting who you are. When I forget who I am in relation to God, and when I forget who I am in relation to the person next to me, that's when I begin to feed on this negativity and complaint, and it changes the way I behave. Let's start in Matthew chapter 20. I'm going to begin in verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. One of the most important choices anytime you're reading a parable is to figure out who you are in the parable. And when you pick the wrong person, you miss the whole point. Okay? There is someone who is the master of a house and the owner of a vineyard. That is not you. In this parable, you are not the person in charge. You are the person who is out there standing on the street looking for work. You are the laborer. Every person in this room is one of the laborers. Nobody in this room gets to be the other guy. That person is God and God alone. We in this parable have to remember from the start, we are the hired help, not the master of the vineyard. If you can keep that in mind, the rest of the parable starts to make sense. The second you put the shoe on the other foot and decide you are the person hiring people, you lose sight of everything you're supposed to learn. So the first lesson is maybe the easiest to learn, hardest to apply consistently. In this story, you, me, we are the hired help. We are not the master of the vineyard. So he goes out and he needs people to work in his vineyard, and he goes out early in the morning at sunrise, and he finds some people who are looking for work. The text says, after agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. We talked about this last week a little bit. A denarius is just the standard pay for one day's work in the first century for some kind of day laborer. We call them day laborers for a reason. They're not salaried. They're not under contract. They get up every morning and they go out there and they stand and they hope someone hires them. Okay? This is going to be important to the story. These are not people who have a 401k. These are not people who have benefits and medical insurance. These are not people that have any promise from week to week. They live day to day, not paycheck to paycheck, day to day. What they bring home today is going to feed their family tomorrow, and that's it. They are not saving for a vacation. They are buying bread. Okay? And the going rate for a full day's work in a field, sun up to sundown, I'm talking 12 hours. Okay? Full day's work, 1 denarius. And so the owner of the vineyard goes out and he agrees with them on a particular amount. This is important too, because this is the only time he makes a promise this specific. To the group he hires first, he says, you come work for a day, I will give you 1 denarius, and you can go and take care of your family when the day is over. But then later in the day, about the 3rd hour, so we're counting hours from sunup, okay? So if sunup is 7, you just go to the 3rd hour, right? He goes out a few hours later, and there are still people standing out in the marketplace looking for work, okay? And he's got more work. And so he sees them standing idle in the marketplace, and to them he said, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right, I will give you. So they went. So pause. The first group, he made a specific promise. I will give you for 1 day's labor, 1 denarius. To this group, they're desperate. They know they don't even have any bargaining position, as if the other guys did. They really don't. They can't say, well, let's talk about salary. They are still there 3 hours in, and they have no work. They don't ask how much. The master says, I'll give you what's right. You either trust him or you don't. And this group of guys said, better than nothing. You give us what's right, we'll go work. And so they go and they work in the vineyard. And this process happens throughout the entire day. He goes out again 3 hours later, the 6th hour of the day. He goes out in the 9th hour of the day. And he does the same thing. He finds people looking for work. He says, if you come work the rest of the day, I'll give you what's right. They're desperate. They trust him. For whatever reason, they go to work. Okay? Finally, the text says, at the 11th hour. So again, think about this. This story started at sunup. 11 hours later. Maybe I could read, that would help. 11 hours later, there are still some guys standing in the marketplace who haven't found work all day. Keep that in mind, because that's really important to the story. 11 hours later, there's still guys standing out there. Why are they standing out there? Put yourself in these shoes for just a minute. You want to go out and find work. You start at sunup. You don't find any work in the 1st hour. You say, well, okay, I'll stick around a little while and see what happens. You don't find any work in the 2nd hour. You say, well, I'll stick around and see what happens. How many hours are you willing to stand around waiting for somebody to hire you? At what point is it no longer worth it? These guys are still standing there 1 hour before sundown. Why haven't they gone home yet? It's because they can't. Because if they go home empty-handed, their children don't eat the next day. They're not out there because they're looking for a little extra hobby money. If they go home now empty-handed, they have to look their wife and their children in the face and say, I haven't got anything. Hope you can stretch the stew a little further. These are men in desperate need. And 11 hours in, they're still standing there because they can't go home. And the master comes and he says, hey, there's just an hour left, but if you'll come work for me, I'll do something for you. No promises. He said to them, they say, nobody's hired us, that's why we're still here. He said to them, go into the vineyard too. Just go work. No promise of specifics. Okay? So when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. What are you expecting? Okay? If you're the 11th hour guy, you've been waiting all day, you are expecting anything. I don't know what fractions of a denarius is. I don't know how to do ancient commercial computation. But it's not a lot. 1/12 would be all that you could ask for if we were hiring by the hour, right? They worked 1 hour. They're hoping for anything, that maybe if they could get work tomorrow and put it together with what they got today, maybe they can buy some food, maybe they get by one more day, maybe they're okay. They're hoping for anything. So you can just imagine the joy on these guys' faces when the foreman comes out, full day's pay for 1 hour's work. And they're just relieved. For 11 hours, they thought they were going to have to go home and look at hungry children and say, you get to be hungry another day. Instead, they get to go home and say, full day's pay. These men are relieved. To the degree that they are relieved, some other guys aren't, as we'll see in the verses that follow. There are very different reactions to the outcome in this particular story. I want to pause as I'm talking about it and make kind of a side point that's going to relate, and if you'll just stay with me, I think it's important. Everybody in this story had been through a full day. One group had been in a full day out in the sun working. One group had been a full day in the market worrying and wishing they were working. Everybody had a full day, and nobody got paid to the end. There's a little expression I try to remember and often forget. The journey comes before the destination. Nobody got paid till the end of the day. And if you'd asked them at any minute during the day, either group, any of the groups, do you like what you're doing right now? All of them would have said, no, not really. The guy in the marketplace says, no, I'd rather be working. The guy working saying, well, I'd rather be at home. Nobody actually liked what was going on, but they're doing what they're doing because they have an expectation that at the end, when they finish the journey, there's something there that's worth it. But the journey has to come before the destination, and no two journeys are alike. Which group had it better that day? Serious question. I feel that, by the way. I've been taking allergy medicine all week, and mine has done nothing. I'm deaf in this ear, can't hear anything. It's just full of water or whatever fluid, so I feel that. Which group of people had it better that day? The guys that worked 12 hours or the guys who worked 1? The easy answer is, hey, the guys who worked 1 hour didn't do hardly anything. They had it easy. I'm going to challenge that and say you're wrong. I'm not sure that's true. Can you imagine? Today is the day I've got to work to feed my family. They weren't on vacation taking naps for 11 hours and then woke up and said, oh, I better find some work. They had stood there in the marketplace for 11 hours watching everybody else get a job and thinking about how they were going to feed their kids that day. 11 hours of despair or 12 hours of work. Which one do you prefer? I mean, I know the outcome is really impressive, but you think about the journey. No two journey is alike. Isn't it wild? Both groups of people in this story thought the other guy had it better. The guy who worked all day thought, man, I wish I could have been one of the guys who showed up and worked 1 hour and got paid. And the guys who were in the marketplace all day said, man, I wish I could have got a job today. I wish you could have hired me in the morning. I wish I could have got anything. Both group of people thought the other guy had it better. No two journeys are alike. What we got to remember is that God promises the destination and not the journey. The promises of God are outcomes that come as results. We get there in very different ways. Think about these churches again that might be reading this gospel. You got a Jewish person and you got a Gentile person. Jewish person lived his whole life following the law of Moses, doing the things he thought were right, paying his tithes, making his sacrificing, reading the law, going to synagogue, doing all the things he's supposed to do. And he was promised by God and the prophets, if you do these things, one of these days God's going to make everything okay. In comes, sits next to him a Gentile. Gentile had known nothing of God's law, had possibly been serving at a pagan temple all this time, worshipped idols, done all the things you're not supposed to do. maybe even flouted the moral laws of God, and did awful and lascivious things all his life. And now comes the gospel preacher, and he tells him by Jesus Christ, God's going to make everything okay. Those people had very different journeys to the same place. And God had promised them the same destination, but the journeys were different. And ironically, both of them thought the other guy had it better. The Gentile looked at the Jew and said, "You know so much more about God than I do. You spent your whole life reading the Scriptures. This is all new to me. I found out about this Messiah business yesterday. I wish I had what you had. I wish I had godly parents that had raised me to know right and wrong." The Jew looked at the Gentile and said, "You got to go out there and sin and have fun and do whatever you like for your whole life, and then you come in at the 11th hour and hear the gospel, and apparently we're all headed to the same place." Both groups thought the other group had it better. Both of them lost sight of the message. God doesn't promise the journey. He promises the destination. He tells us where we're headed. Everyone in this room has a different journey, a different road we take to where we're headed. No two people have the exact same story. Not you and your spouse, not you and your kids, not you and the person in the pew next to you. Nobody in this room has exactly the same story. Because we're not promised how we get there. We're promised the destination. And when we lose sight of that, the negativity and the contention comes in because we can start comparing ourselves to everybody else. Negativity comes when we want the destination but not the journey. I want to get there now, and I don't want to think about the mess between here and there. One of my favorite places on the whole planet are the Rocky Mountains. I love to be there. Every time I go there, I look at Celine and say, "I'm not going back home. I'm just going to stay right here. See you later. Let me know how the kids do." Never works out. I always come back. I've been a few times, and every time I have the same experience. If you're going to Denver, Celine and I took a trip for our 10th wedding anniversary a decade ago, and we went to Denver, and I'm excited because we're going to the mountains, and I love mountains, and I get in my car, and I'm excited, and about 3 hours into the trip, I think this is a horrible mistake. You know why? Because I'm not in the mountains. I'm in Kansas. And I'm a little biased, but I'm going to tell you, and I'm sorry if there are native Kansas people here, I'm just going to insult everything about you now. Yeah. You have the worst state to drive through. There may be good things about your state, but every 10-mile stretch in Kansas looks like every other 10-mile stretch in Kansas, interrupted by an off-ramp, a grain silo, and a gas station, followed by 10 more flat miles. And there's all that driving, and the whole time I'm doing that, I'm thinking, these aren't mountains. This was a horrible mistake. Why? Because I love the destination, not so eager about the journey, but you can't get there any other way. And my negativity comes in when I think I can just skip a step. When I think, why am I here instead of where I'm going? You can't get there until you go through here. That's just the way life works. Negativity comes when we want the destination, but not the journey. Christianity requires you to put in some work. And you know what? Work is hard. Work is challenging. It requires you to face your own personal demons and to fight through the mess of life alongside other people who are doing the exact same thing. Negativity comes when I want to be there before I'm here. Now, when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. This is the only group, the group that started first thing in the morning, is the only group who had been told specifically, this is what you will get paid. But something changed throughout the day as they start comparing themselves to other people. They began to make assumptions. And they assumed, that's the important word, if that guy is getting more, obviously I'm going to get a lot more. Negativity comes from assumptions. Who made them believe they would get more? No one had said anything of the kind. They had been told one thing, work all day, you get paid that much, and this is exactly what happened to the letter. God kept his word. The negativity came when the assumption started coming. And I began to think, well, I know how it's really going to go, because that's the way I'd do it. On receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house. Pause there. All complaints are directed at the master of the house. Don't forget that. When you're grumpy with the person in the pew next to you, that's not actually the person you're unhappy with. I got to tell you, there's a great quote from the late Tim Keller. He said, "Worry is not believing God will get it right, and bitterness is believing God got it wrong." When we complain, we're not actually complaining about the person next to us. We're complaining about the God who put them in our lives. We're complaining about the God who gave them that journey to the same destination. I'm not mad at you, I'm mad at God. And that should frighten me a little bit. These fellows are not frightened, and they grumble and complain at the master of the house. And they say, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." Remember what I said earlier? Both groups thinks the other guys had it better. We were out here all day. Now, never mind, they're not thinking about the guy worried whether he's going to get to eat standing in the marketplace. All they remember is how hard their journey was, and they have this assumption. Mine was harder, his was easier, clearly I deserve more. And then that phrase in the middle, you made them equal to us. You know why? Because you are. I was the one who made a distinction. In this entire parable, there's only been 2 groups of people, the master and the laborers. But what did I do? I made my own little group. There's the early morning laborers like me, and we're the good people. And then there's the late evening laborers like you, and y'all are bad. And then the master has the audacity to treat us like we're the same. Fact is, we are the same. Different journeys, same destination. Same relationship to God. The guy who got there at sunup was a laborer, a hired hand. The guy who got there at sundown was a laborer, a hired hand. Neither one was the master. Neither was in charge. The negativity in this story comes from comparing ourselves to others. By looking at the other guy, assuming he's got it better, thinking about the way I think it ought to be in his life, and making assumptions based on that. One of my favorite little texts in the Gospel of John is at the very end of the Gospel of John. This is after the crucifixion. This is after the resurrection. Jesus and Peter are working through some personal issues. Peter has denied Jesus 3 times on the day of the crucifixion. Remember this? And Jesus has been talking to him about it for verse after verse after verse. And so Peter, very cleverly, tries to change the subject. He says, "Well, what about this guy?" He's pointing at John, the other apostle. He points at John. He said, "Oh, Lord, what about this man?" And Jesus said to him, "If it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." What is Jesus' response? Peter says, "What about that guy?" And Jesus says, "None of your business. You have one job. You follow me." What happens to John? None of your business. You follow me. What did that guy over there get paid for how many hours he worked? None of your business. You follow me. What was his journey like? Was it easier than mine? None of your business. You follow me. Why am I the way I am and they're the way they are? None of your business. You follow me. And so that's what the master says. He replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for 1 denarius? Remember, in the early part of the day, we made a deal. I told you how much. I gave you that much." Negativity comes when we forget what we were promised. We have never been promised by God to have a life like anybody else in the room. We have never been promised an easy life. In fact, when we signed up, we were told, your Lord was crucified for living this way. It might be challenging. All we have been promised that God will make it worth it in the end, that God will make everything right. We were promised nothing else along the way. But when we forget that, when things get difficult and we forget what we've been promised, we start to get negative and contentious and start comparing ourselves to everybody else. The owner says, "Take what belongs to you and go." And I have to think that was not said politely. I don't know how you read it. I don't think it was "take what belongs to you and go." I think it was "take what belongs to you and go." I choose to give to this last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge me my generosity? What are we actually mad at? Remember the story of Jonah? Jonah goes and he preaches to the city of Nineveh. He says, turn or burn, and I hope you burn. He's miserable. He hates the people of Nineveh. He wants them to die. But God said, go preach to them, so he preaches to them. They all repent, and so God spares them, and Jonah pouts. And God asked Jonah in Jonah chapter 4 that great question, Jonah, do you do well to be angry? He's not mad at Nineveh, he's mad at God. He's mad at God for being gracious and forgiving. He doesn't like the fact that God's graciousness applies to everybody. He's compared his life to the people of Nineveh and thinks he deserves more of what they're getting, and it's not fair. Do you begrudge my generosity? Actually, the literal translation out of the Greek is kind of interesting to me. It quite literally says, is your eye evil because I am good? Why is God being good making you worse off? And when you say it that way, it's kind of silly. Why am I mad that God is generous? Fact is, negativity comes when we think we are the director of the play. I am very pleased for God to be my God as long as he is doing exactly what I would do if I were him. As long as God is doing exactly what I would do if I were him, I could say, boy, that God, he is very wise. I like him. The minute he does something I would have done a different way, and by the way, every one of you would have done this story different, right? All of us know how hourly wages work. All of us would have said, well, that guy only worked an hour, we're only going to pay him an hour's wage. All of us would have done it differently. God did it this way, and we're mad at him because of it. Because I actually think deep down inside that I'm actually in charge, and God's only right because he's doing it my way. And so those people in the pew in the first century, the Jew and the Gentile sitting next to each other that didn't get along, ultimately they were mad at God because he wasn't doing it their way. They thought it should have been different than the way it was. And God had something else in mind. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ to put on Christ. Which ones? Who are the good ones? There's neither Jew nor Greek. The journey doesn't matter, only the destination. The Gentile got there one way, the Jew another. It didn't matter. When you go into the waters of baptism, only one thing comes out. A Jew goes in, a Gentile goes in, a Christian comes out the same. There's neither slave nor free. People on completely different ends of the economic spectrum, completely different ends of society, both go into the water, one thing comes out. In Christ Jesus the same. There's neither male nor female. Again, completely different roles in the life of a normal society. They go into the water and one thing comes out, and it's a Christian. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you're comparing yourself to other people in the room, and you find that makes yourself bitter with God, what we're forgetting is that he calls the shots. And this is what he's made of us. And it's good. We call it good news for a reason. The gospel is good news. What he's doing is in our best interest. When we come up with negativity, it means we are just not looking at what he is doing. Today, the invitation is simple. If you've not put on Christ, if you have not become what he is going to make of you, you need to do that now. If you have put on Christ, you need to remember what you became when you came out of the water. And what you became is a person going to the same destination as every other person who came out of that water. Different journeys, same destination, same loving and gracious God. We're going to stand and sing. If we can help you to respond to that invitation in any way, won't you come?